It began quietly, as most nightmares do. It was a Tuesday in early spring, one of those nights where the air outside is still clinging to winter, but the inside of the house feels too warm under thick blankets. We had just put Emily down for the night, our 6-month-old daughter with a laugh like wind chimes and cheeks like blooming roses. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked, her tiny chest rising and falling in a slow, perfect rhythm beneath the soft nightlight glow. Around 1:40 a.m., the baby monitor crackled to life on my nightstand. A brief wave of static came first, harmless, familiar. Then came the sound, a soft coo, the kind that would usually make me smile. "She's just dreaming," Mark mumbled beside me, his voice half swallowed by sleep. He didn't even open his eyes. "Go back to bed." I nodded and turned over, but something about that coo made me pause. It lingered in the air a bit too long. There was a hesitation in it, almost like it had intention. Then came the giggle. At first, it was innocent, playful even. Just the kind of laugh a baby might give while floating through dreams of color and sound. But then, another giggle followed, then another. The tone changed, growing louder and sharper with each burst, almost mechanical in rhythm, like something trying to mimic laughter rather than truly feel it. The monitor speaker buzzed with her laughter now, filling our room with a sound that felt wrong. Not because it was loud or because it woke us, but because it didn't stop. Babies, according to every article I had obsessively read during my pregnancy, go through short bursts of REM sleep where sounds like these are normal. They can giggle, cry, twitch, even open their eyes. But those episodes only last a few minutes at most. Emily laughed for nearly 30 minutes. I lay there frozen, each minute stretching into the next. I kept watching the clock. 2:13 a.m. The time was burned into my mind like a brand. When the laughter finally stopped, silence didn't bring peace. It brought dread. I felt the air change, like the room had sunk into itself. My hand reached for the monitor's volume dial, trembling slightly. "I'm checking on her," I whispered. Mark stirred but didn't argue. Maybe he felt it too, that something was off. I padded down the hallway, every board creaking louder than it ever had before. The nursery door stood half open, the soft green nightlight casting a wash of glow onto the carpet. I stepped inside. The air hit me like a slap, colder than the rest of the house, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in that one room. Emily was lying in her crib, just as we had left her, eyes closed, peaceful. Her tiny fist curled around the edge of her blanket, her breathing slow and even. There was no sign she had ever been awake. I stood there for minutes, watching, listening, trying to find logic in the stillness, but something felt wrong. Not visually, not audibly, but viscerally. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like someone was watching you, even when no one was there? I backed out slowly, trying not to disturb her. I told myself it was a fluke. A long REM episode. Interference on the monitor. Something explainable. But even then, even in that moment, I knew this wasn't just the first strange night. It was the beginning of something else. Something watching. Something waiting. And it had started with a giggle. If the first night was unsettling, the nights that followed became unbearable. It wasn't just the laughter. It was the precision of it. Every night, without fail, the baby monitor would come alive at exactly 2:13 a.m. Not a minute before, not a minute after. Always 2:13. A time now burned into my mind as sharply as Emily's cries had once soothed me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a quirk of her sleep cycle. Maybe her REM sleep, by some odd biological clock, always occurred at the same time. But babies aren't predictable. Their sleep is supposed to be chaotic, shifting from night to night. This wasn't chaos. This was routine. Unnatural routine. The laughter, too, had shifted in tone. It was no longer the innocent, random giggles of a dreaming baby. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like it was being performed. It would start soft, as it always did, almost playful. But within minutes it built to a manic pitch, bordering on hysteria. Sometimes it echoed through the monitor like there was more than one voice. "This isn't normal," I whispered one night after the 4th episode. staring at the ceiling as her laughter echoed through the static. Babies laugh, sure, but not like this. Not every night, not at the exact same time. Mark groaned beside me, rubbing his eyes. She's fine during the day, perfectly healthy. She smiles when I hold her, babbles like she should, hits all her milestones. I didn't argue, but I noticed the way his hands trembled when he picked her up now. The way he started avoiding being alone in her room after dark. The dark circles under his eyes matched mine, both of us worn thin by a dread we couldn't name. That night, I did something I thought would help. I set up a small nanny camera in her nursery. Nothing fancy, just something we could view from my phone. I angled it toward the crib, making sure it could see everything. I needed to know what she was doing during those episodes. I needed proof that this wasn't just in my head. The footage from that night still lives on my phone. I haven't deleted it, though I've been tempted. Emily lay still for most of the night. No movement, no sound. But at 2:13 a.m. her eyes snapped open. It wasn't the slow flutter of waking, but a jarring, deliberate motion. Her eyes didn't drift or blink. They fixed directly on the camera. I felt my blood turn cold. She didn't cry. She didn't move at first, just watched. And then, slowly, she sat up. Too smoothly, too controlled. 6-month-old babies don't sit up like that, not without wobbling or effort. But she did it like she'd been doing it her entire life. And then came the laugh. It wasn't the sweet, airy sound we knew from the day. It was sharp, echoing, forced, like something using her voice. My chest tightened as I watched the screen. But the most terrifying moment came when she turned her head and stared directly at the camera lens. I don't mean vaguely in its direction. I mean locked in. Eyes tracking it with surgical precision, despite the fact that it was a tiny black device tucked into the shelf above her crib. There was no way she could see it. The room was dark. The nightlight was dim. She shouldn't have known it was there, but she did. Her laughter built to a crescendo. Then, suddenly, she stopped. Her mouth froze mid-giggle, and for one long, chilling second, she smiled. Not a baby smile. Not the gassy, reflexive one I was used to. This was knowing, measured, wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Mark after I showed him the footage. The next morning, I reviewed the video again, frame by frame, and found something even more disturbing. At the exact moment her eyes opened, the room's temperature display, visible in the corner of the camera feed, dropped 7 degrees in under 2 seconds. There was no heater malfunction, no window open. Just that sudden, inexplicable chill. Mark said nothing when he saw it. He just rubbed his temples and muttered, "Maybe it's a glitch." But he didn't sound convinced. That day, Emily was her usual self, playful, bright, giggling at her toys, grabbing Mark's nose, cooing at the sunlight dancing on the ceiling. But when night came and the clock read 2:12 a.m., I felt it, the tension in the walls, the pressure building in the air, a presence. And when the monitor crackled again, beginning that terrible countdown with the softest coo, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a sleep issue. It wasn't developmental. It wasn't even her. Whatever this was, it wasn't just happening to Emily. It was happening through her. If the second week taught us anything, it was this. Whatever was happening wasn't stopping. It was growing, changing, learning. Emily's behavior began to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. It wasn't just the laughter anymore. It wasn't just the 2:13 a.m. wake-ups. It was what we'd find after the episodes. Evidence that something, someone, was active in her room after the lights went out. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I walked into the nursery early one morning to find Emily sound asleep, but her toys were different. They weren't scattered the way babies leave them, haphazard and careless. They were arranged, organized, a row of blocks lined up from smallest to largest. Her plush giraffe sitting perfectly upright next to the crib, facing the wall. Her rattles formed into a triangle, a pattern. I crouched to get a closer look and felt a chill run through me. Her stuffed bear, one with black, glossy button eyes, was sitting alone in the center of the room, its face turned upward, staring at the ceiling. "Mark?" I called out, suddenly unsure of everything. "Did you come in here during the night?" He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his face pale and drawn. "Number Y." I stepped aside so he could see. His eyes widened. "She can't even crawl yet," he muttered. "There's no way she could have moved these." That's what we kept telling ourselves. She can't even crawl. But each morning told a different story. The next night, I stayed up watching the baby monitor with the camera feed playing on my phone, the volume turned down low. The first few hours passed quietly. I drifted off around 1:30 a.m., phone still in my hand. I woke up suddenly. Not from sound, but from cold. The air around me had gone frigid again. I looked at the clock. 2:14 a.m. I had missed it. Fumbling with my phone, I rewound the camera footage by 1 minute. Then 2. And what I saw made me drop the phone to the floor. At 2:13 a.m., the camera showed Emily in her crib, lying still. Then, in one slow, fluid movement, she sat up. Her arms moved. Not clumsily like a baby's, but gracefully. Almost deliberately. She reached out and placed her hands on the crib rails. Then, with ease no 6-month-old should have, she pulled herself upright. My breath caught in my throat. Emily couldn't do that. She had never done that. Not even once during the day. But the worst part wasn't the movement. It was the look on her face. Her eyes were wide open, fixed not on her toys, not on the door, but once again, on the camera. She knew it was there. She knew we were watching. And she smiled. Not a grin, not a baby giggle. A smile. Quiet, confident, calculated. Then the screen flickered, the footage distorted, the image rippling like heat waves rising from asphalt. For a few seconds, the screen turned black. When the image returned, Emily was no longer standing. She was sitting on the nursery floor, outside her crib. I froze. That was impossible. The crib had rails too high for her to climb. We had safety measures in place. There was no way she could have gotten out. But there she was, sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by her toys, arranged in a perfect circle. Mark didn't speak when I showed him the footage. He just turned, walked into the bathroom, and threw up. That day, I scoured online forums, blogs, even obscure corners of Reddit, looking for any story that resembled ours. I found nothing concrete, only whispered accounts. One post stood out. A parent describing how their baby would wake every night at the same time, rearrange toys, and then smile too wide for her face. The post had no replies, no updates, just silence. And that silence spoke volumes. The next morning, I found the mobile above Emily's crib spinning slowly on its own. I hadn't touched it. There was no breeze. The window was shut tight. I stood in the doorway and watched it turn, each plush moon and star drifting by like it was being pushed by something unseen. And that's when I noticed the shadows. There was no source for them. No lamp. No light. No obstruction. Just shifting, dark shapes curling across the walls, almost like fingers. Reaching. Searching. I backed out slowly, closing the door behind me, heart pounding in my ears. Later that night, I remembered something from a horror game I had seen on a friend's console a few months earlier. The Baby in Yellow, a cartoonishly creepy game where a child behaves more like a demon than a toddler. In the game, the baby can levitate, rearrange objects, vanish, and reappear. It's all meant to be humorous, satirical. But this wasn't funny. And this wasn't a game. It felt like something had seen that idea and decided to make it real. Emily continued to sleep through the day like any normal baby. She smiled, reached for her bottle, laughed when Mark made silly faces. But at night, something else was in her place. Something intelligent, something aware, something waiting. 3 weeks in, we stopped pretending this was normal. We had endured almost nightly episodes of unexplainable laughter, rearranged toys, freezing air, and the creeping feeling of being watched in our own home. But nothing prepared us for the voice. It happened just after 2:13 a.m., as it always did. I was lying in bed, staring at the monitor's silent screen, dreading the moment it would come alive. The static was the first sign, a hissing whisper that had become the audio equivalent of a countdown. And then, right on cue, Emily's laughter began. Only this time, it ended early. After less than a minute, her giggles tapered off into silence. That should have been a relief. But instead, it made my skin crawl, because the quiet felt unnatural, heavy, like the house was holding its breath. And then we heard it. A voice, low, breathless, and not from Emily. She likes it here, with me. I sat bolt upright. Mark did too. The monitor crackled again, and the voice was gone, just static, nothing else. We stared at each other in stunned silence for a full minute, neither of us willing to say the obvious. What was that? Mark asked finally, his voice thin. I couldn't answer. I threw the blankets off and rushed to Emily's room, Mark right behind me. We didn't bother being quiet anymore. We flung the door open. Emily was sitting upright in her crib, perfectly still. The nightlight cast long shadows across her face, but her eyes were bright. Too bright. She smiled when she saw us. Not scared. Not surprised. Almost welcoming. The air in the room was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from a cracked window, but the kind that comes from somewhere else entirely. Wrong cold. Like walking into a tomb. When I flicked on the overhead light, it buzzed and flickered before finally illuminating the room. Emily blinked at the brightness and reached out to me with tiny hands. She was just a baby. But somehow I felt like I was being tricked. The next morning, we tried to rationalize it. Baby monitors pick up interference all the time, Mark said. It could have been a neighbor's radio or some CB chatter. But even as he spoke, his hands trembled around his coffee mug. Neither of us believed what he was saying, because that voice, it wasn't random static. It wasn't garbled or distant. It was in the room, clear, intentional, like someone had leaned in close to the microphone and whispered. And the way Emily smiled when we arrived, as though she knew we'd heard it. I replayed the recording from the monitor again and again, hoping the voice had been some trick of fatigue. But it was there, always there, that same breathy whisper. She likes it here, with me. That day, I couldn't stop watching her. I followed Emily from room to room, observing her every movement. She was perfect, innocent, babbled, played with her toys, reached for my necklace and giggled when it jingled. But I kept waiting for something to crack through that facade. And later that afternoon, while I was folding laundry on the floor beside her playpen, I heard her humming. It was soft, barely a tune, a simple 3-note hum, over and over. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, just a happy noise. But as I sat there, the pattern became too distinct, too rhythmic. It was a melody, one I didn't recognize, but one she repeated perfectly, like she was remembering it from somewhere. I picked her up, searching her face. "Emily," I whispered, "where did you learn that?" She looked at me, wide-eyed, silent. Then she touched my lips gently, and for just a moment, I could have sworn her eyes weren't hers. They were watching me with an awareness no infant should have. That night, I begged Mark to set up 2 monitors, one in her room, one in ours, and leave the recording running. "I just need to know we're not going crazy," I told him. "We need proof." He agreed. That night we didn't sleep. We stayed up in bed, staring at the glowing red time on the nightstand clock. The minutes crawled toward 2:13 like a funeral march. And then, right on schedule, the laughter started. It didn't build like it usually did. This time, it was sudden, loud, piercing. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. Silence. We held our breath. Then the monitor erupted with static. And from it, that voice again. "She doesn't cry anymore. She laughs for me." Mark dropped the monitor. It clattered to the floor as we bolted from the room and rushed to the nursery. Emily was standing in her crib. Standing. Holding onto the rails with steady hands, swaying gently as if rocking to an invisible lullaby. She turned her head toward us as we entered, and I swear to God, her mouth wasn't moving. But the voice, that same breathy whisper, spoke again, and it came from somewhere within the room. She belongs here now. Emily began to giggle. And behind that giggle, beneath the laughter that we once adored, I heard something else. Another laugh. Not hers. Deeper. Older. Hungrier. Denial only works for so long. By the time we reached week 4, our fear had become a full-time occupation. We weren't sleeping. We barely ate. Every night we waited, like prisoners, to see what Emily would do next. But it was no longer just Emily. We both knew that now. Whatever was in our home had latched onto her, like a parasite wearing her giggles as a mask. I needed answers. If science couldn't explain it, then I would search beyond science. While Emily napped one afternoon, peacefully as always during the day, I pulled out my laptop and dove into the deep, dark corners of the internet. I searched forums, old news articles, even urban legends. I typed in everything I could think of. Babies laughing at night, same time every night. Baby monitor voices, infant possessed, crib shadows. The results were disturbing. Most of the hits led to message boards with usernames long since abandoned. One thread stood out. A mother in Ohio describing how her infant would wake every night at 2:13 a.m., humming a tune she never taught him. Toys moving. Cold spots in the nursery. She had even recorded what she described as a man's voice whispering through the baby monitor. The thread ended abruptly. No update, no goodbye. Just a last post that read, "He's not my baby anymore." I kept digging. I stumbled across academic papers about sleep disorders in infants, night terrors, parasomnias, even rare cases of hypnopompic hallucinations in babies. But none of these conditions explained the things we were witnessing. Babies don't levitate. They don't hum ancient songs. They don't speak in someone else's voice. Then I came across something darker. Stories rooted in old folklore. Tales of changelings. Spirits or entities that would replace a human child with something else. Something wrong. The myths varied. In some, the changeling would mimic the child perfectly until the family forgot their real baby had ever existed. In others, the creature would slowly manipulate the household, feeding off fear until it could manifest in full. A terrifying pattern emerged. Across centuries and continents, people told stories of children who changed, who stopped being themselves, children who laughed when they should have cried, who sang songs no one had taught them, who stared too long, smiled too wide, just like Emily. That night, I showed Mark everything I had found. At first, he resisted, clinging to his grip on logic. But then I showed him the newest footage, recorded the night before. It started normally. Emily lying still. Then, as always, 2:13 a.m. But this time, the shadow came back. It didn't enter from the side of the frame like before. It rose from under the crib. Like smoke, it drifted upward and coalesced into something roughly human-shaped. Head, shoulders, arms, but distorted, like a smear on a mirror. It hovered over Emily as she giggled, and when her eyes opened, she didn't look afraid. She looked delighted. Then the shadow stretched a single arm outward and touched her forehead. That's when Emily began to hum. The same 3-note melody I'd heard that afternoon. Mark turned pale. That's not... She didn't move her lips. She's not singing. But the sound is coming from her. I nodded, numb. And she does it now during the day. We knew then that we needed outside help. So for the first time, we considered something we had laughed off before. We called a paranormal investigator. I didn't know what to expect. I imagined someone in a black cloak with salt and crystals. Instead, we got a middle-aged woman named Helen who wore hiking boots and carried a notebook. She didn't promise anything, just asked us to show her the room. She walked inside and stood silently for several minutes. Emily was sleeping in our room that day. The nursery was empty. Still. But Helen's face gradually changed. Her lips tightened. Her brow creased. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling, the corners, the crib. She asked us to leave the room so she could be alone. We stood outside the door, holding hands, too afraid to hope. 10 minutes later, she emerged, pale, breathing heavy. "Something happened here," she said quietly. "Not recently. A long time ago. There's a residual energy, grief, pain, and something else. Something stuck." Mark looked at her, desperate. "What is it? What do we do?" Helen shook her head. "I don't know. This isn't a typical haunting. This is tied to the child somehow. It's not just feeding off her. It's mirroring her, becoming her." She recommended a cleansing, suggested we get out of the house for a few days. But I already knew the truth. We couldn't run, because whatever this was, it hadn't followed us to the house. It had been waiting. By the 5th week, the fear had stopped being sharp. It had become something dull and constant, like a low-grade fever we couldn't shake. We weren't just exhausted anymore. We were unraveling. Every night was a waiting game. We no longer hoped it wouldn't happen. We just waited to see what form it would take next. Then, one night, the giggling stopped altogether. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, whatever had taken root in our daughter had left. But the stillness was worse, heavier, like the silence before a scream. It was 2:13 a.m., of course, when the monitor flickered on. But instead of laughter, we heard something else. A voice. Emily's voice. She wasn't giggling, crying, or cooing. She was singing. It started as a hum, soft, almost melodic. Then, like a music box winding itself open, the words came. In a voice that was far too clear, too steady for a 6-month-old, she sang, "Midnight baby, laughing bright, calls the shadows into night. Midnight baby, eyes so wide, has a friend who wants inside." I felt the breath catch in my lungs. It wasn't baby babble or mimicry. It was structured, intentional. Mark stared at the monitor, frozen. The words repeated, slower this time, as though she were being taught the rhythm, the cadence, the tone, like something was coaching her. She sang it again and again, each time more perfect, more haunting. It wasn't just her voice coming through the monitor either. There was a second layer beneath it, faint, deep, humming with her. An undertone that sent chills up my spine, like a backing track of something ancient, humming in harmony. Mark leapt out of bed. We sprinted to the nursery, flung the door open, only to find Emily sitting upright, swaying gently, her eyes wide open. Her lips moved in time with the song, but the sound wasn't coming from her throat. It filled the room from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floorboards. She looked at us, still swaying, still mouthing the words. "Midnight baby, laughing bright." We couldn't move, couldn't speak. The only sound was that awful rhyme, crawling its way into our skulls like a virus made of melody. Then, on the final line, "has a friend who wants inside." Emily's gaze shifted, not toward us, but toward the corner of the room, the one shadowed space untouched by the nightlight. And for the first time, Mark saw it too. A shape, barely perceptible, almost human, standing completely still in that corner, darker than the darkness around it, as though the light simply refused to exist there. I stepped toward the crib, reaching for Emily, and as I did, the music stopped. The humming, the rhyme, everything, gone. Emily blinked and reached out, smiling like nothing had happened. But when I picked her up, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in that too-perfect voice, "He likes my song." That was the first and only time I screamed in front of her. We left the room immediately, locked the door behind us, and took turns staying awake the rest of the night. That day, Mark began making calls. Experts, priests, mediums, anyone who might understand what we were dealing with. And while he searched for answers, I began my own investigation into that rhyme. It wasn't in any lullaby books. I searched children's songs from all over the world. Nothing. I called my mother, asked if she remembered any old verses or playground chants. Still nothing. But then, I found an old blog buried deep online, long abandoned, written by a retired folklore professor. One post, dated 2003, included a list of regional superstitions collected from elderly residents of a small New England town. One rhyme stood out. Midnight baby, shadow's friend, laughs until the story ends. When you hear the rhyme once more, someone's waiting at the door. According to the professor, it was used to warn children not to sing after midnight, because the rhyme, they said, wasn't a song, it was a summoning. The moment I finished reading it, the monitor turned on by itself, and through it came a single knock, not at a door, not on wood, but on glass. Like fingernails on a window pane. We didn't speak much during the drive to my parents' house. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loud with everything we couldn't explain. Emily slept the whole way there. She hadn't done that in weeks. No humming, no giggling. Just the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a baby who finally knew peace. When we arrived, my mother scooped her up in her arms and pressed her face into Emily's hair, sighing with relief. "She looks so healthy," she whispered. She didn't see what we had seen. That night, Emily slept in a guest room with me while Mark took the couch. There was no monitor, no camera, just the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall and the sound of her steady breath. I stayed up anyway, watching the time. 2:13 a.m. came and went. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, and the next, and the next. Emily returned to her old self entirely. She played, she smiled, she babbled like a normal baby. The shadows were gone from her eyes, and the rhyme, the awful rhyme, never passed her lips again. We stayed with my parents for 2 weeks. In that time, Mark and I barely talked about the house. We pretended it had all been a shared fever dream, but we both knew better. Eventually, we had to go back, to collect what we'd left behind. Heavier, like the silence before a scream. It was 2:13 a.m., of course, when the monitor flickered on. But instead of laughter, we heard something else. A voice. Emily's voice. She wasn't giggling, crying, or cooing. She was singing. It started as a hum, soft, almost melodic. Then, like a music box winding itself open, the words came. In a voice that was far too clear, too steady for a 6-month-old, she sang, "Midnight baby, laughing bright, calls the shadows into night. Midnight baby, eyes so wide, has a friend who wants inside." I felt the breath catch in my lungs. It wasn't baby babble or mimicry. It was structured, intentional. Mark stared at the monitor, frozen. The words repeated, slower this time, as though she were being taught the rhythm, the cadence, the tone, like something was coaching her. She sang it again and again, each time more perfect, more haunting. It wasn't just her voice coming through the monitor either. There was a second layer beneath it, faint, deep, humming with her. An undertone that sent chills up my spine, like a backing track of something ancient, humming in harmony. Mark leapt out of bed. We sprinted to the nursery, flung the door open, only to find Emily sitting upright, swaying gently, her eyes wide open. Her lips moved in time with the song, but the sound wasn't coming from her throat. It filled the room from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floorboards. She looked at us, still swaying, still mouthing the words. "Midnight baby, laughing bright." We couldn't move, couldn't speak. The only sound was that awful rhyme, crawling its way into our skulls like a virus made of melody. Then, on the final line, "has a friend who wants inside." Emily's gaze shifted, not toward us, but toward the corner of the room, the one shadowed space untouched by the nightlight. And for the first time, Mark saw it too. A shape, barely perceptible, almost human, standing completely still in that corner, darker than the darkness around it, as though the light simply refused to exist there. I stepped toward the crib, reaching for Emily, and as I did, the music stopped. The humming, the rhyme, Everything. Gone. Emily blinked and reached out, smiling like nothing had happened. But when I picked her up, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in that too-perfect voice, "He likes my song." That was the first and only time I screamed in front of her. We left the room immediately, locked the door behind us, and took turns staying awake the rest of the night. That day, Mark began making calls. Experts, priests, mediums, anyone who might understand what we were dealing with. And while he searched for answers, I began my own investigation into that rhyme. It wasn't in any lullaby books. I searched children's songs from all over the world. Nothing. I called my mother, asked if she remembered any old verses or playground chants. Still nothing. But then, I found an old blog buried deep online, long abandoned, written by a retired folklore professor. One post, dated 2003, included a list of regional superstitions collected from elderly residents of a small New England town. One rhyme stood out. "Midnight baby, shadow's friend, laughs until the story ends. When you hear the rhyme once more, someone's waiting at the door." According to the professor, it was used to warn children not to sing after midnight, because the rhyme, they said, wasn't a song, it was a summoning. The moment I finished reading it, the monitor turned on by itself, and through it came a single knock, not at a door, not on wood, but on glass. Like fingernails on a window pane. We didn't speak much during the drive to my parents' house. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loud with everything we couldn't explain. Emily slept the whole way there. She hadn't done that in weeks. No humming, no giggling. Just the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a baby who finally knew peace. When we arrived, my mother scooped her up in her arms and pressed her face into Emily's hair, sighing with relief. "She looks so healthy," she whispered. She didn't see what we had seen. That night, Emily slept in a guest room with me while Mark took the couch. There was no monitor, no camera, just the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall and the sound of her steady breath. I stayed up anyway, watching the time. 2:13 a.m. came and went. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, and the next, and the next. Emily returned to her old self entirely. She played, she smiled, she babbled like a normal baby. The shadows were gone from her eyes, and the rhyme, the awful rhyme, never passed her lips again. We stayed with my parents for 2 weeks. In that time, Mark and I barely talked about the house. We pretended it had all been a shared fever dream, but we both knew better. Eventually, we had to go back, to collect what we'd left behind. The real estate agent met us at the door. She had a sheepish expression, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. "There's something I should have disclosed," she said, not quite meeting our eyes. Mark narrowed his gaze. "Now you tell us?" She nodded. "I didn't know it would matter. Most people don't believe in this sort of thing." She handed me a document, an incident report from April 1956. There had been a fire. The nursery had once belonged to a baby boy named Daniel. The fire had started in the crib itself. The cause was never identified, only that it had burned fast, and that the child had died before anyone could reach him. The mother, Eleanor Whitmore, was institutionalized shortly after. She had insisted, right up until her death, that Daniel's spirit remained in the house, that he was waiting for someone to play with. I handed the folder back. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't want to know anything else. We took only what we needed: clothes, personal items, photo albums. As we pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I looked back at the nursery window. Just once. And that's when I saw him. Not Emily. Not a reflection. A boy. Small, still, and shadowed, staring through the glass. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just watched us leave. And from the monitor, buried deep in a sealed box in our trunk, came one last faint sound. Not static, not interference. Just the final line of the song. "Has a friend who wants inside."